Dr. Benjamin Anderson. I'm one of the hospitalists here at Logansport Memorial Hospital. So, every year we do develop the flu vaccine, and we try to get that to people and decrease the overall burden of the disease of influenza. And so it is, it's a common disease, but it can be a deadly disease. And for that reason, also because we have the vaccine to be able to prevent even getting it, it's very important that we try to get people to go ahead and get the vaccine and hopefully prevent the burden of disease that comes with it. Every year in flu season, hospitals reach capacity. It's a very, very common thing that I experience, and as a hospitalist, it's something that I'm acutely aware of every flu season. And I think a lot of people don't understand how important it is to try to decrease the amount of hospital utilization during those times by preventing illness. Basically, what happens every year during flu season, I get into a situation where I have a patient who might need, they might need a specialist, or they might need a service or some sort of intervention that we can't provide here at Logansport. And so we have to transfer that patient. And there are many, many times where there are not beds available in the facilities that I'm trying to transfer patients to. I've waited as long as 5 days to get a patient transferred to a hospital because there were no beds available, and there are no beds available not just in the first hospital I asked, but in any of the hospitals that I've asked. I've had to transfer a patient out of the state before because there were no beds available anywhere in the state for the patient who needed the service that couldn't be provided here and needed to be in a larger facility, and there was simply nothing available in the state to do so. Every year this happens with flu, because people get sick, and even if they're not dying from the flu, they're sick enough to be in the hospital with the flu, and they take up a lot of the beds in the hospital. So this year it's particularly important with COVID, where we have this new disease that is, it's making enough people sick that they're taking up extra beds that they wouldn't have taken up otherwise. If we get the flu on top of that, there's a real potential that it could completely overwhelm the capacity of hospitals to deal with that. And the flu, having a vaccine available for the flu, that's one easy way that we can look at and say, hey, as much as possible, let's try to prevent people getting sick with this and make sure that we can keep the hospitals at a lower level of patient volume so we can keep those beds open. So it's a common misconception that people think that the flu shot makes them sick. What it does do is it presents part of a flu virus, not a live virus that would infect you otherwise, but it presents part of a virus to your immune system so that your immune system can better recognize the flu when it sees it. When that happens, you get some activation of your immune system. And so sometimes people do get some low-grade fevers and some aches and pains because your immune system is kicking on and it's learning to recognize that virus so that when it sees it for real, it can eliminate it. And so that's why people sometimes think, oh, I got the flu shot and I got sick. That can be part of the misconception with it. The other part of it is that we typically give the flu shot at the time where flu starts to ramp up. So there are some people who, maybe they did get the flu shot, and within a week or so they got the flu because they had been exposed. The flu shot does not take effect immediately. You need a couple of weeks to let your immune system learn to recognize the virus. So sometimes if people get the flu shot and then they do actually come down with the flu just because flu was out in the community at the time that we're typically giving the shots, that's something that sometimes people can think it was the shot that gave it to them when actually they picked up the flu before the shot was able to become effective. So that's another reason it's important to go ahead and get the flu shot at the appropriate time to make sure that it's going to be as effective as it can be before you actually encounter flu. Probably the most common complication from the flu is is not the flu itself, but bacterial pneumonia that people get secondary to the flu. So, your immune system basically gets knocked down fighting the flu virus. You've been sick, and then you get a bacterial pneumonia on top of that. That's probably the most common cause of hospitalization in somebody with the flu that I see. It does affect the breathing sometimes. It can affect the lungs. So people who have bad lungs to start with, and then they get influenza on top of that, it can certainly make their lungs worse in that regard. They get the COPD patients, they can sometimes get pretty sick. They can have low oxygen levels and end up in the hospital with that. The worst case scenario that you can get with the flu is something that we would call ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. And that's something that has actually, that has been what has killed a lot of people with COVID. That can happen with influenza too. It doesn't happen as often as it seems to be happening with COVID, but it does happen. I have had patients die of that, that had influenza as the causative factor. So that's not a real common complication of influenza, but it is certainly something that we see, and that happens every year. There are people who die of those complications from influenza every year.